Well, it is a magic hour. We've got a couple dozen people on here. I'm going to go ahead and begin and say thank you to everyone for joining us. I know we've got members, we've got guests, and I appreciate everyone taking the time to be here. This is being recorded in case you've got someone who wants to hear the information but couldn't log on right now, in case you've got to jump off a little bit early. So that will be available to you. Let's see here. I just want to confirm everyone is here to listen to the education event, the Legacy of Women's Clubs in Idaho. That's what our fabulous speaker, someone who's an expert on this, is going to, we're very privileged to have her be giving us the talk. It's Hannah Hine, a friend of mine. She has always had a passion for history. Here's her official bio. She graduated magna cum laude with a BA in History and Ethnic Studies and a certificate in Western American Studies from the University of Colorado Boulder in 2011. She graduated with an MA in Applied Historical Research from Boise State University in May 2015 and joined Stevens Historical Research Associates as a research historian. Then in August 2019, she assumed the position of state historian with the Idaho State Historical Society. As state historian, Hannah Laurie serves on the agency's leadership team, is a content resource for Idaho's executive and legislative branches of government on topics related to Idaho history, assists in the agency's interpretive analysis, ensuring historical accuracy in programs, exhibits, and collateral, and authors articles for various media channels. She is currently leading the agency's efforts for Idaho Women 100, a year-long statewide initiative that commemorates and celebrates the history of women's suffrage in Idaho. To complement her academic and professional achievements, Hannah Laurie is involved with several organizations. In August 2017, Hannah Laurie led an Arch Walk presentation for Preservation Idaho, and in June 2018 moderated a public lecture as part of the City of Boise's Fettuccine Forum on women's history and voluntarism. Since 2016, Hannah Laurie has served on the Boise State University Alumni Association Board of Directors and has held leadership roles with the Junior League of Boise, recently becoming president-elect, which she didn't include, but I just added in there. Congratulations. And serves on the board of directors for the Center for the American West. So I am thrilled that we've got Hannah Laurie here. I didn't say my name. I'm Molly Harder with the Education Committee. I will be checking the chat and the Q&A throughout Hannah Laurie's presentation, so feel free to throw in any comments or anything there. And I'll turn it over to Hannah Laurie. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Molly. So I'm going to share my screen so you can all see some of the really phenomenal, I think, photographs and items that I found while trying to put this presentation together. And I do have, my notes here in front of me, so if you hear me ruffling papers or things like that, that's just making sure that I'm on track with what I'm going to be talking about and making sure I'm not leaving out any of the really important parts. So again, as Molly mentioned, my name is Hannah Laurie Hine, and I am the state historian with the Idaho State Historical Society. I am actually the first woman to hold this role since 1956. So I hold that, kind of nugget of information in really a special place in my heart. I feel very, very grateful to be in this role and to be sharing on this particular talk the history of women in Idaho. And as Molly mentioned, last year we really had an opportunity to celebrate 100 years of women's suffrage. But part of our Idaho Women 100 effort was really to make sure that we were continuing the conversations about Idaho women and women in history just more generally after that centennial. So in a way, I'm more excited to give this presentation now in 2021 than I may have been to give it to you last fall. But again, I appreciate your flexibility as an organization. I have, okay. Yes. Great. So last year, as we were celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage, I do just want to mention briefly that, in certain states and across the country and other places around the world, many women actually had an opportunity to exercise their right to vote before the passage of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. And of course, Idaho was one of those suffrage states. So I did want to just make mention of that. I will talk kind of briefly about suffrage as I get into the presentation at parts. So having that kind of as context at the beginning, I think, will be important. But the state of Idaho actually passed a state constitutional amendment in 1896, which extended suffrage to women here within the state of Idaho. And we joined the ranks of Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado when we passed that measure. But really, when we're talking about women's rights, women's organizing, women's suffrage, women's efforts across time, you know, there's an era that spanned from about 1880 through the 1920s that historians have really characterized as this progressive era. And it was really a time in history when social activism and political reform were kind of the mainstream. And the folks that were behind those efforts were predominantly white women. Now, there were efforts from Native American women and some African American women as well to become part of that movement. And so I don't want to discount their efforts or their stories at all. But in terms of Idaho's story, there were fewer women of color involved in those early, progressive era efforts, but they did exist. And really what was happening during this time is that women were attempting to reflect on and bring change to some of the negative consequences that had resulted from mass industrialization, urbanization, political corruption, and really a growing immigration drive. And so those were the catalysts that drove change and drove organizing during the progressive era. But to really understand how that particular moment in history evolved and how important it became, I always like to look a little bit farther backwards and provide, again, some context. So if you look back to the very early moments in American history, there, again, were kind of outliers and women outliers who attempted to bring some semblance of normalcy to maybe some of the chaos that was existing at the time. And so during the early colonial period, what we see are women and women's groups. To a smaller extent, it was typically individual women who were exercising their rights and their voices through this concept of benevolence. And the English Oxford Dictionary defined benevolence in the early 1800s as a disposition to do good and a desire to promote the happiness of others, to spread generosity and charitable feeling. And so at the turn of the 19th century, so moving from the 1700s, mid to late 1700s into the early 1800s, a number of things are shifting, right? Kind of that family unit where wives did nearly everything, the cooking, the cleaning, the sewing, all of those items and all of that effort. It didn't lose importance, but what we see is that there were markets that were emerging. We were shifting kind of the economic focus to have more merchants and to have more opportunities for goods that you could purchase. And so women, especially women who were in the upper classes, all of a sudden had just a little bit of extra time that they could then devote to other goods. And so that was really, again, that very, very early attempt to use their voice and to, especially in this case, use their place of privilege to make change. And so one of the most visible women from that period who, again, had the place in society, had that opportunity to exercise her voice, was Abigail Adams. And of course, she was the second First Lady of the United States. And during her reign kind of as First Lady, she was relatively vocal. Again, it was a different time period, so you wouldn't assume that Abigail Adams could be as vocal as, say, the feminists of the 1970s. But within that context, she was relatively vocal. One of her most famous quotes, and I have it on the screen, I'll read, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." And so in this sentiment, she's really trying to vocalize that there should be a place for women in political life and in civic life, in church life, in ways that her ancestors had not had a place. And so in response to this letter, John Adams responded, quote, "Your letter was the first intimation that another tribe more numerous and powerful than all the rest were grown discontent." And so again, there is at least an acknowledgement that there may be opportunities for women and for women to work jointly and, maybe in larger groups to exercise change, because again, there was an acknowledgement that that movement was already starting and already existed. A couple of other women from this time period that, again, utilized their privilege and utilized their place within society to attempt to drive change, to attempt to leave an impact on society were Mary Wollstonecraft and Judith Sargent Murray. Both of these women were actually writers, and they put together a number of treatises and essays and pamphlets. But really at the crux of what both of them were trying to say in their work was that women are, put into a certain mold within society, not because they are less, not because they are anatomically, inferior, but at the crux of it is that they did not have the same access to education that men had. And if they had that same access to education, they could do all of the things that men could do, and they could maybe do them better. Judith Sargent Murray lived from 1871 to 1820, and her most famous piece was called On the Equality of Sexes. And shortly after she finished that piece, she had a quote that came out in one of the newspapers of the time that said, "We are about to form a new era in history." And really, it was very shortly thereafter that we start to see the emergence of the first women benevolence organizations in the early republic. And so, of course, that quote, we could say that today, that we are about to form a new era in women's history. And in pulling together this presentation, that's really what I have found so fascinating, is that we really built on the efforts of all of the women that have come before us, Judith and Mary included among them. So then what do I mean by benevolence, and what do I mean by kind of this next emergence of opportunity? So about 1820, the United States enters into what historians today call the Second Great Awakening. And this was actually the second Protestant Reformation that happened in the United States. And really, this particular religious movement emerged in part because of how the country itself was developing economically, right? So you have the agricultural South that was growing in size, and it was growing in power. And then you have the kind of pre-industrial North beginning to take shape. And so what that meant is that there were opportunities for women to emerge to really build on this idea of benevolence, of doing good, of providing charitable giving. And what the Second Great Awakening allowed for was women to utilize this idea of religious reform as a way to exercise more of their moral feelings and more of their moral ideals through kind of the facade of religious awakening. During this period, what we really see are women of that maybe upper middle class beginning to advocate for more opportunity and beginning to take efforts to, engage in their communities and to try to improve their communities. This again goes back to that concept that as market economy shifted and as more merchants and economies developed, women all of a sudden had a little bit more time on their hands to do this kind of work. And so what we see from the Second Great Awakening was really the very, very early stages of what would become the anti-slavery movement, the abolitionist movement. This also was kind of the birthplace of the temperance movement, so that effort to prohibit alcohol consumption and manufacturing. And in a way, it was also the birthplace of the suffrage movement. And those three national efforts kind of grew up at the same time. They all kind of came to a head about the mid-1800s and got their footing. We'll see through the rest of the presentation, of course, that the anti-slavery movement had a more visible and quicker end or result of their effort, whereas the suffrage movement ended up lasting about 70 years after slavery was officially abolished. But again, these movements all kind of started at the same time, and a number of women who were involved in one of these efforts likely was involved in one of the others or in all of them. Some of the earliest benevolence organizations that stemmed from this period included a group called the Female Association for the Relief of Women and Children in Reduced Circumstances. So a lot of, kind of trigger words in there. They were very focused on what they were looking to impact and where they wanted that change to come from. That particular organization was in Philadelphia. And then during this period in the North, there were also women's organizations that included freed slaves and freed women of color. One was called the Benevolent Society of St. Thomas and the Daughters of Africa. These were both on the East Coast, in the northern area. And so there, again, are these kind of trends that are starting to develop and starting to emerge. And even though we're talking about a moment in history where really the only way to communicate was via handwritten letters and newspapers, it's pretty astonishing to see how widespread these efforts really were. And at this particular moment in history, early 1830s and 40s, that kind of western frontier, just to place everything into context, was essentially Appalachia and some of the Great Plains, but the real drive in westward migration wouldn't come for another 10 or 15 years. And so even though we have women attempting to make efforts to impact change in their communities, to build on this idea of benevolence, we of course have the rest of society saying, wait a minute, I'm not so sure about all of this. And at the time, what they were really fighting against were stereotypical ideals of where women should be and what women should be doing. And any woman who didn't necessarily fit into that mold caused concern. And so during the 1830s, 40s, kind of into the 1850s, we have what is called the cult of domesticity. And this developed, again, because certain women, certain outliers were trying to drive change, and there needed to be a concerted effort to stop it or to at least try to slow it down. So as you can see from the image on the screen, that was a very prescribed arc of existence. Mother, child, bride, mother, widow, etc. And so as women were trying to combat that prescribed role in society, they started to see a shift in how they could make impact in their community. And so it's really right after this cult of domesticity kind of develops and gains strength that women across the country say, we're gonna shift so that this cult of domesticity maybe doesn't keep us in these prescribed roles. And so what that next shift looked like was a movement from benevolence as the effort and as the foundation of their effort to moral reform. And what this shift is really characterized by is a narrowing of focus more than anything. So instead of a individual woman or a maybe small benevolent organization saying we want to give back to the poor, we see the emergence of women's clubs saying we are going to specifically fight prostitution because that is a moral sin. And prostitution, more than anything, leads to neglected children. And neglected children are things, are are bad, and we want to prevent it if we can't help the children who are being neglected. And so this kind of narrowing and slight shift, again, from benevolence to moral reform, also built on the ideals that emerged during the Second Great Awakening. There was a strong religious undercurrent to this particular moment in kind of women's organizing. In addition to the prostitution as kind of a central target of their reform efforts, prohibition was another one that gained a lot of steam during this period. And there was also a really strong effort to look at how society dealt with mentally ill and physically ill and other minority groups. So it's really kind of at this point in time into the 1850s, we see women starting to come into the role of nursing for the first time, specifically to try to improve the way ill patients and mentally ill patients were being treated in the systems. The last thing I'll kind of just say about this moment in time is that, you know, as I'm sure many of you watching have seen over your lifetimes, you know, there are moments where you had an opportunity to kind of get your foot in the door, or you had an opportunity to practice something that would become a central characteristic of your leadership style or something along those lines. And so it's during this moral reform effort that we really see many of the leaders of the suffrage movement emerge kind of in their own right. Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott, who were the women who went on to form the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in 1848. They practiced in moral reform efforts during the 1840s and 1850s. And we also had two other women, Sarah and Angelica Gemke, who became incredibly involved with anti-slavery efforts in New York. And they had actually launched the first women's anti-slavery convention in the late 1830s. So again, about a 2-decade period of time where we start to see change really taking form in a maybe more visible way and a more impactful way. But of course, you know, as certain moments are happening on the East Coast, the rest of history is unfolding. And we can't disregard or ignore the fact that westward expansion was a very, very big thing. And it was driven by ideologies that today would make most of us, you know, uncomfortable. And that kind of ideological catalyst for westward expansion was called Manifest Destiny. And so the image that I have on the screen here is a very famous painting by John Gast. It's called American Progress, and he painted this in 1872 to really characterize the movement of peoples that had happened, you know, 10 or 15 or even 20 years before the painting. And you literally see Native peoples being driven off the canvas. The woman who is there bringing with her these ideals of democracy and these ideals of freedom is clothed in attire that is reminiscent of Greek and Roman times, when, you know, the birthplace and the birth of democracy really took hold. But she's also bringing with her technological innovations, right? She's carrying the telegraph line with her. And you see also that with this movement, you have other technological innovations coming right after her, the railroads and irrigated agriculture and, you know, farming and ranching. And so there's, again, this really obvious concerted effort to move people across the Western Plains, across the Intermountain West to the Pacific Ocean, under these kind of falsified ideals of equality and freedom, because that was only limited to a very confined group of people. At the same time, we have general westward migration really taking hold. We also see the United States enter into one of its not the first, but it's a big armed conflict, the Mexican-American War. that ranged from 1846 to 1848, and this was under President Polk's administration. And in rallying support for this war, he also utilized these ideologies based in manifest destiny. And then, of course, throughout this entire time period, even before we had the creation of the United States as a country, the divide between the agricultural South and the industrial North has only intensified to the point that we land ourselves in an incredibly bloody civil war that landed between 1861 and 1865. And the real outcomes of that particular conflict, at least from a legal standpoint, were the passage of 3 constitutional amendments to the United States Constitution. The first, of course, is the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and Congress ratified that on December 6, 1865. The 14th Amendment declared that all persons that were born in the United States were citizens. That came out in 1868. And then the 15th Amendment, which will have some implications for the suffrage movement that developed later on, basically outlined that voting rights cannot be denied by race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that one Congress ratified in 1870. And you'll hear that sex was not included in the 15th Amendment. There was no effort to, well, there was an effort to include sex in the language of that amendment, but it ultimately failed. And so that is in part why suffragists continued their efforts to expand voting rights and to eliminate the barriers based on sex through constitutional amendments kind of later on in the story. And of course, you know, this presentation is about Idaho. So to bring the Idaho story into this, we kind of had to wait till the 1860s. You know, even as Abraham Lincoln was in the midst of directing, you know, the Union Army and serving as commander-in-chief in that Civil War conflict, he took the time to sign the Idaho Organic Act, which created Idaho Territory. So he signed that on March 4th, 1863. And at the time that he created Idaho Territory, it was actually the largest named territory in the United States. It included nearly all of Montana and Wyoming and parts of the Dakotas. It was a massive land mass. And it entered into the Union as a free territory. So it did not include provisions that would allow for slavery in Idaho Territory. And the very first capital was not here in Boise, it was actually in Lewiston. So the first territorial governor, William Wallace, had at his privilege the kind of decision-making authority to say where the capital would sit. And he did have mining interests in North Idaho, and so he landed on Lewiston as the location for the territorial capital. His role in Idaho history was rather short. Somebody else succeeded him rather immediately, and a couple of years later, the territory then did move to Boise. That's a topic for another presentation. But you know, I mention this just to remind everyone that, well, let me back up. So Lewiston was the capital at one point, but when they had made that decision, it actually sat within the boundaries of the Nez Perce Reservation. And so again, this is just a reminder that even though this story and these efforts primarily depict the experiences of white women, there were other people of color in the mix and in this period, this time period, whose stories are relevant and whose experiences matter in the larger picture of what was happening in Idaho. And so again, I just want to preface all of these conversations and all of what I'm talking about with an acknowledgement of the diversity that actually existed in the West and especially in Idaho, kind of at its birth. But what we see then is as the territory moved from Lewiston to Boise, that happened in 1864, and it was really solidified in the courts in 1865 and 1866. we see the population surge in the Boise Valley and in the Boise region. In fact, at one point, Idaho City was the largest producer of mineral wealth in the entire Pacific Northwest. And the population in Boise by about 1865 outnumbered the population in Lewiston by 6-1. And so people were coming here specifically for those kind of opportunities, women included. And what we then see happening in Idaho and really in the rest of the country is kind of a condensed effort to replicate all of those earlier movements of women's organizing and women's, vocalizing and women's work, but on a very condensed timetable. So you have individual women who try to use benevolence as that foundation for why they want to be more involved in community, why they want to be able to support and give back. Then you see a slight shift again towards that moral reform effort, utilizing religious trends to further the cause, if you will. But by the time we get to Reconstruction, which is again that moment in time after the Civil War where the country is trying desperately to bring everyone back together, and then the Gilded Age, which spanned from about the 1870s through the late 1880s, early 1890s, we see the West trying to catch up with what was happening on the East Coast. And again, the population growth and the movement of people into the area really just happened on an accelerated schedule. The kind of national moments that helped drive that, of course, was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in Promontory, Utah in 1869. Idaho received its first rail line into the territory in 1874 at Franklin, and then throughout the 1880s, we see the development of more rail lines. These modes of transportation also allowed for more African-American freed slaves to move into the territory, and we see a huge growth in the population of Chinese immigrants at the same time, in part because of the mining opportunities that existed in the territory. So again, this story is about white women, but they're operating within a very diverse kind of ecosystem. And the emergence of women's groups on the frontier, again, mirrored a lot of what was happening on the East Coast. And in fact, I think one of the reasons that suffrage in particular happened in the West before it happened on the East Coast, even though it started on the East Coast, was because of the opportunities that this very rugged place afforded women when they got here. You didn't have cities that were established and homes that were built. You had sagebrush for miles and miles, and water if you were lucky, and neighbors that were 10 miles away. And so out of sheer necessity, the role that women played in the development of the West was much larger, and that kind of cult of domesticity and the spheres that they were expected to stay within on the East Coast were much more fluid out in the West, and of course here in Idaho as well. And so as we talk about women's organizing, suffrage, of course, is a huge component of this. And so what we see happening is that conversations are happening in newspapers and in territorial legislatures across the region where they're talking about the women's question. And that, of course, is reference to suffrage and should women have the right to vote. And as we see Idaho develop, part of what allowed the territory to become a state has to do with population. And so you see in neighboring states, Wyoming, for example, this effort to use population as the crux for why they should extend suffrage to women, because if women could vote, women would come. If women came, men would come. There would be a large enough population to apply for statehood. And so Wyoming is actually the first territory and the first state that extended suffrage to women. But kind of on the coattails of that effort, which happened in 1869, Idaho's territorial legislature had very serious conversations about extending suffrage to its women And in 1870, a gentleman named, I should have his name, Dr. Joseph William Morgan, he was from Malad City, and he put forth a proposal for a bill to extend suffrage. And what's interesting about this is that it died in a tie vote. It made it out of committee, it made it to the floor of the House, and it died in an 11-11 vote, which I think really shows how serious suffrage had become in the West. It wasn't like this was a one-off person who was interested in it. There was support both for it and then opposition against it. And so just to kind of close out where we are on suffrage, again, I know that you all probably had lots of opportunities to hear about suffrage stories last year, but I want to do the topic justice because we have to continue the conversations about women's history and not wait another 100 years to celebrate it. But Idaho was unique in that it extended partial suffrage to women during its territorial history. In 1879, women were allowed to vote in school elections, and then in 1885, they amended that law again so that women could hold office in school-related positions, so county superintendents of education, for example. And those opportunities, again, gave women a chance to be more vocal in their own communities. And then throughout the rest of the 1880s, the suffrage movement here in Idaho really kind of happened on a grassroots effort and a grassroots level. So we had organizing, but it wasn't the kind of organizing that we would see later in the suffrage movement, where it was very large and the scale was, immense, and the weight of the effort wasn't as hard at that point because we were just getting the ball rolling, right? Once we get later into the 1910s and 19-teens, it had more of a serious impact because you had some states that had extended suffrage and some that hadn't. And so to be in the middle of that, it just felt different than it did in the 1880s here in Idaho. They did attempt to bring in suffrage as part of our state's constitutional convention. There were two parties kind of vying for the legislators' attention and time during that convention. Abigail Scott Duniway was one of Idaho's very, very vocal, very visible suffragettes, and she was pushing for suffrage as a right of citizenship. She spoke to the convention for nearly an hour, really driving home that point that women are people, women contribute to this community, women contribute to this territory. There is absolute reason as to why they should have the right to vote. The kind of flip side of that argument was presented by a woman named Henrietta Skelton. She was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and she was arguing that if women had the right to vote, again, moral reform would be easier to pass, i.e. prohibition. But again, ultimately, the Constitutional Convention leaders decided that statehood in and of itself was more important at the time than trying to include suffrage as part of that effort. So they did not include a suffrage amendment in the Constitution and went forward with their application to Congress. And Idaho did become a state on July 3rd, 1890. We were the 43rd state to join the Union. And what that meant is that in order to enact suffrage here, it would have to go through a state constitutional amendment to be law of the land. So then 1890 through about 1895, we see the emergence of women's groups based on suffrage efforts. The first women's suffrage club emerged in Hagerman in 1893. It was formed by a school teacher named Elizabeth Ingram. And then in 1895, the state finally gets its first suffrage organization, which was the Idaho Equal Suffrage Association, and it had delegates from across the counties. It had support of some of the national organizations in driving suffrage here in Idaho. And we know that, from last year's celebrations, that Idaho became the fourth state to extend suffrage. We did it through a state constitutional amendment, and it would not have been successful had women's organizing not been a factor. And so again, I could talk for hours about suffrage, but I do want to get into kind of the rest of the history of women's clubs here in Idaho. And so, again, back to the very beginning of my presentation where I said between the 1880s and the 1920s, we had the emergence of women's groups, and that was really what characterized that moment in time. I hope at this point we realize that everything builds on each other, and that the efforts of all of those earlier women were critical to getting the country into a place that it was in by the 1880s and 1890s, so that progressive ideals had a foundation on which to build. And again, this period in American history, this foundation, or this progressive movement, was characterized really by an effort to bring order to chaos. That's kind of the tagline of this era. And it's during this period that we see citizen reformers, that was not another really popular term, who realized more than anything that joint action and that working together in a very organized and intentional way would have a stronger impact on effecting change and in achieving change than individual efforts would have alone. And so through this thinking, the end result, in addition to an improved society, would also have been opportunities for more political and civic engagement for women. And then, of course, as more women joined this movement, it did a couple of things, right? It meant that the entire movement gained validity, and the idea of women's reformers as a movement gained momentum. And this happened not just in the United States. There were efforts like this across the world. In fact, we are celebrating International Women's Day today because of some of those international efforts. The first International Women's Day dates back to 1911, when Denmark, Austria, Switzerland, there's another country, declared an International Women's Day. At that point, they were celebrating it in February, but again, the sentiment remains today. The other thing I'll just mention about this kind of general topic and general period is that, especially on the East Coast, this was really in a response to the negative consequences of urbanization and immigration. Here in Idaho, I mentioned we had population growth and movement of people, but we didn't have the same tenements and dismal living conditions that women on the East Coast had. So there is a slight distinction between how things developed here, but the purposes behind those efforts were very much in alignment. And, we can't really talk about the progressive era and the women's club movement without making mention of Jane Cunningham Crawley. This woman, I think, is really pretty incredible. She was the founder of what would become the General Federation of Women's Clubs. She was a journalist on the East Coast. She ended up forming the first press club for women after she was denied entrance to hear Charles Dickens speak. And so in 1889, she ended up kind of founding what would become the General Federation of Women's Clubs. But what made her club unique was that she didn't want this particular effort to have a charitable or socioeconomic purpose, but she simply was seeking a collective, and this is a quote, a collective elevation and advancement of women. And so what we'll see as we look at individual clubs and their development in this region, they do have a socioeconomic or a charitable mission, but by allowing for those club women to come together in a more general movement, you see that Crawley's efforts to elevate women collectively and to advance women's opportunities collectively generated support, and it really kind of came to fruition. She also, and I think it's important to note, that she thought that the task of lifting women throughout all levels of society would lead more naturally to reform. And so I think this is the first opportunity where we really see a leader in the white women's suffrage and club and, reform movements, making an acknowledgement of inclusivity. And again, it's not the same inclusivity we're talking about today, but I interpret that language on a level of inclusivity. And so what about Idaho? Where are we in terms of the story of women's clubs here? Well, there are a number of clubs that I could have talked about and mentioned in this presentation, but of course, suffrage being a component of that, and temperance, of course, was a component of that here too. But the clubs that emerged during the Progressive Era also focused on education, city beautification efforts, music education, historic preservation, literacy support groups. It kind of spans the gamut. But I have to start and make mention of Boise's Columbian Club. And I know that Carol Hoytel's on the call today, and I believe she's the president of that club this year. It is the last remaining Columbian club in the country. If you're not familiar with it, talk with Carol. They are accepting memberships for that club right now. And it's the first organized women's club in the state of Idaho. And I'm going to get into its history here in a minute. But by 1890, oops, not yet, almost. By 1894, Idaho had formed its own chapter of that General Federation of Women's Clubs. And it had a number of inaugural clubs across the state, including, I'm going to read them off the list so I don't get their names wrong, the Chautauqua Club of Caldwell, the Entre Notice Club, and Santa Rosa Club of Mountain Home, the Outlook Club of Weiser, the Fortnightly Club of Haley, the Tuesday History Club, Parliamentary Club, and Columbian Club, all of Boise, the Village Improvement Club of South Boise, the Current Events Club of Blackfoot, the Study League and Civic Club of Pocatello, the Women's Literacy Club of St. Anthony's, and the Women's Century Club of Nampa. So again, a wide gamut of locations and club names. By 1912, the Idaho Federation of Women's Clubs boasted 52 club affiliates with a total of 2,000 members across the state, which is pretty remarkable. And so again, Boise's Columbian Club, this was the first, it's still around. So many of the women who were members of the Columbian Club went on to do amazing things kind of in their own right. Although the Columbian Club itself was not a suffrage organization, it never came out specifically supporting suffrage. A number of the women who were in this club were suffragists. It was founded in 1892. Alice Ramsey Strawn and Carrie Logan were the kind of original founders, and they came together at a request of the Idaho legislature to develop a kind of strategy for creating a building for the Chicago's World Fair Columbian Exposition. And so this was the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in America. That was the theme for the World's Fair. And so on May 2nd, 1892, these women came together and organized themselves in the chambers of the House of Representatives at the Idaho State Capitol. And they selected a committee of women to help do the fundraising and develop the plan for furnishing this house that would then go on to be built for the exposition. The World's Fair itself ran from May 1st to October of 1893. And a number of the women that were in that kind of planning committee included incredibly prominent women. Mary Reidenbaugh, she was a very visible suffragette here in town. Margaret Cobb and Mary Halleck Foote are just some of the names. But really, although they were, they came together for a very specific purpose, after the Columbian Exposition, the club women decided there's reason for us to remain, together and working together. And so over the course of its nearly 130-year history, the Columbian Club has done, things in the community that there wouldn't have been someone else there to do it had the Columbian Club not existed. We had a Carnegie Library because of the Columbian Club. They developed the State Traveling Library, which was a precursor to the State Library. They, have done stuff even recently. They helped save the O'Farrell Cabin. In the 1960s, they were incredible partners with the City Library here at Boise and the City Zoo in bringing educational programming. So really just an incredible legacy of club women, again, utilizing these ideals that had emerged over 100 plus years of working together, being organized, finding a foundation on which to build, and then putting in the work to make change. This particular club also had women who supported efforts to preserve a lot of Idaho's scenic landscape. In 1911, there was a club woman who successfully lobbied our congressman to introduce a bill at the US Congress to create a Sawtooth National Park. Now, unfortunately that never came to fruition, but it ensured that the sawtooth preservation efforts were part of the conversation for decades. How are we on time, Molly? 10 more minutes?
You can have 10 more minutes, absolutely. Thank you.
So Margaret Roberts and Mary Halleck Foote were some of the other women in the Columbian Club who were just, again, incredible women. Margaret Roberts was known as the petticoat governor of Idaho because she was so instrumental in prefacing, political life in a way that up until this point, women really hadn't had an opportunity to do. She was influential in driving suffrage at a national level and in representing Idaho along the way. She actually was a director and librarian for the State Historical Society during World War II. She was the director of the Traveling Library, a position that she acquired in 1905 and really held throughout her life. If I could sit down and have a cup of coffee with anyone, I think it would be Margaret Roberts. She's just incredible. Mary Halleck Foote, if you're not familiar with who she was a famous author and illustrator of the American West, originally from New York, but she moved out here in the 1880s with her husband. He tried a number of schemes to make some money and ultimately was not very successful in any of them. But because of her writing and her illustrating, that was really what kept her family afloat. If you have time, I would really encourage you to drive out to Lucky Peak Reservoir. There's a new interpretive center at the site of Mary Halleck Foote's Boise River Canyon home. Incredible interpretation, so you can learn more about her there. Both of these women are also going to be featured in the Idaho State Museum's upcoming Trailblazing Women of Idaho exhibition, which actually opens on the 13th. So again, I'd highly encourage you guys to check that out as well. As kind of time progressed, we see the development of additional leagues. The Study League of Pocatello was an organization founded in 1896. Dr. Minnie Howard of Pocatello, who is another very important, prominent woman in Idaho history. She was a doctor in the 1890s. Think about that for a minute. She helped start the Study League in Pocatello. It organized on March 12th, 1896, and their mission was really to promote study for mutual public improvement. So they were coming together to learn, not just for the benefit of learning, but so that they could then take that knowledge and make improvements within their own community. I have a quote from Minnie Howard that I'll read. She said this to their club in 1904, quote, "The ideal club woman is also a home woman. These two are not incompatible nor inconsistent. Every woman should have domestic duties, and most women have domestic cares. The club is the place to lay aside these cares and to learn and think of something outside the home. This has a beneficial effect upon the home." So again, trying to make that argument, even almost 100 years after the cult of domesticity emerged, that women can do both. Women can be mothers and have, civic engagement. Women can be wives and still do other things. And of course, the images that I have throughout this presentation, and these ones in particular, these are original archival documents. They are saved. I was fortunate enough to look in the collections at the Idaho State Archives and found these in a donated collection, but the Women's Study League also has archival materials at the Special Collections Library at ISU in Pocatello. The New Century Club of Blackfoot I found incredibly interesting. So at the time that this club emerged in 1900, there were 4 other clubs of the same name that emerged in the same year across Idaho. And I think that these clubs in particular did something that kind of ushered in a new phase in the women's club movement, because they stressed the combination of study with action. And really, study had been a focus of earlier women's clubs in the 1890s, but at this point, they're really trying to show an urgency behind the action part of that mission. So in addition to Blackfoot, Kellogg had a new century club, Lewiston had a new century club, and Nampa had a new century club. And all of these really, their first effort focused on building a library. And I think that focus also shows the legacy of the Columbian Club, because that was their first focus, and they again started in 1892. The Betterment Club of Emmett was a later progressive era club. It came out about 1920 to 1921, somewhere in there. And this club had a lot of the same components as some of the other clubs across the state. They were focused on education. They had social committees. They had opportunities to welcome newcomers. They were one of the rural clubs within the General Federation of Women's Clubs kind of organization. And I think it's important to recognize that, even in Idaho, where even today a majority of the state's landmass remains rural, that there was a concerted effort by women's clubs in the 1920s and 30s to embrace rural women and to provide more opportunities for rural women, because they knew that they weren't getting those same opportunities that the women in the cities of Idaho were receiving, just simply because of a smaller population size and fewer resources. So it was at this point that the General Federation of Women's Clubs here in Idaho created a separate district for rural clubs, but they allowed rural clubs to cross-list with the first district of the Federation, so that they could have conventions that overlapped and share the resources across all of those clubs. By 1950, that rural distinction was no longer as necessary, simply because, at that point we kind of start to see women's role in society shifting yet again. But I think it's important to acknowledge that for 35 years, there was a very obvious effort to support rural women. And again, just a couple more images of some of these original historical documents from this organization. The other thing, let's see, just checking my notes, but I think I covered all of what I wanted to say about this. Again, rural women through these clubs and through these organizations were provided more opportunities for civic engagement, community building, and leadership and learning. We have another photo here. This is it was taken in Gooding, and it's of members of the Idaho Federation of Women's Clubs. And really what we see is that over the course of the history of the General Federation of Women's Club organization, through the 1950s at least, there were at least 130 clubs recognized as affiliate members, which again, I think that number is pretty outstanding. Here we have a photo of members of the Junior Leagues of America. As Molly mentioned, I am a member of that organization, and I believe a number of you watching are as well. Again, I could give an entire presentation on that club's history, but what I think is important to note with the emergence of junior leagues as kind of an umbrella organization is that they really built on, again, so much of what had come before them, but more than anything, looking at reciprocity of giving, in addition to, you know, benevolence and moral reform. There was like an extra component there that said, by giving, I will receive something in return, whether that is an opportunity for leadership, an opportunity to, you know, kind of get my feet wet in something, an opportunity to be in a safe place to fail. But by giving, you get something back. And so I think the Junior League organization really promotes that and continues to today. Our organization is in its 93rd year, and I'm incredibly proud to be a part of it. And then again, as we kind of come into the mid to late 20th century, this is just another club that I thought was really worth talking about and sharing. This is the Newcomers Club of Boise. They were known as the Welcome Wagon. And from 1947 until the mid-1980s, this club organized and existed as a chapter of a national organization that had first emerged in Tennessee, whose sole purpose was really to promote the civil, social, and patriotic interests of our city, and to, quote, extend a friendly and neighborly hand to all newcomers by introducing them to others like themselves and starting them out on a new social life in their city. This particular organization's historic records consist of scrapbooks, year-over-year scrapbooks. And in one of the scrapbooks from the 1970s, there is a very clear definition of what the club's historian should be doing. And of course, as a historian, I read that and just thought, well, how brilliant. You know, they were intentionally thinking about how they would be remembered. And so the historian's job was to work with the president every year to develop a scrapbook. And so we now have over 16 scrapbooks from this one organization because they took the time to record what they were doing, even though this club's efforts seemed entirely social, right? They weren't trying to raise money to combat poverty. They were just trying to make Boise a more friendly and welcoming city. And in looking through the scrapbooks, I think that they accomplished their feat. So that kind of brings us to the end and looking at really what is the legacy of this organization and the legacy of the movement and the legacy of women's clubs across time and space. And I think that legacy is you guys. The Idaho Women's Charitable Foundation, you know, from your website shows that you started in 2001 and that you thought the idea of pooling resources to enhance philanthropy was the way to go. And here you are 20 years later, and that you have celebrated giving away more than $1 million in Idaho and throughout the community. And from what I've seen from your organization's website, I think it's incredibly telling that you are also here building on the work of all of those who have come before you. And so the way that I think we can continue to make sure that women's stories are being told and make sure that women's impact in Idaho remains as strong as it is today is to think about how your organization will be remembered in Idaho history. You know, I've been able to give this presentation today because of the records that exist in archives here at the Idaho State Archives and in archives around the state. So I'd be happy to talk with you guys about record keeping and record making so that the state historian in 2021 or, you know, 100 years from now will be able to tell your story too. So with that, I will take any questions that you guys have. I know I ran just a little long, Molly.
It's okay. You had such great content, and I was like trying to scribble notes and write things down and keep track of the questions. Let's see here. There were a couple. So yes, as you mentioned, from Columbian Club Laureate Carol Hoytel is with us, as well as the historian, Janice Stephen Dale. If I've not said your name correctly, apologize, Janice, but those two women are on the call. So that was wonderful. And Carol says, call her if you want to join. She's welcoming any members. Another interesting comment that Janice Stivner-Dale made was that, importantly, Margaret Roberts' grandmother from Columbia Club was a Native American, so Roberts balanced this fact as she sought human rights.
Interesting.
So that was interesting. And let's see, secondly, she mentioned one other thing. Many women of the Columbian Club and women who lost their husbands in the mining industry, sorry that scrolled, had no choice but to fight for their rights to work outside the home as an act of survival for themselves and their family. So it wasn't just because they felt like it, they needed to be the provider for their homes. So that was interesting. There's a question here from Denise, and this is slightly off topic, but what do you know about the growth trend of Black and Chinese populations and their decline in Idaho? If
so
those
Chinese populations, arrival really mirrored the development of the mining industry. Japanese Americans and people of Japanese descent came with the railroad, so there's a distinction there. At one point in the 1870 census, there were over 4,000 of Idaho's 15,000 people were of Chinese descent. And so, what I know of that is that as the mining industry slowed and as irrigated agriculture kind of became more of the focus of the development after 1890 and into the early 1900s, that economic opportunity disappeared. And so when that opportunity disappeared, there was, of course, racism and prejudice that existed here in Idaho and throughout the region. That meant that the Chinese were no longer welcomed, in a sense. Now, of course, you always have outliers to those kinds of instances. There was a very, very famous woman of Chinese descent, and her name is escaping me, but I can see her picture. She's also on display in this new Trailblazing Women exhibit. So you can go and read her story. With regard to the African-American community, most of the Black population here in Idaho arrived after the railroads did. And Pocatello actually had the largest African-American population outside of Boise. And again, that was a direct driver because that's where the railroad was first. What I think we can say about the African-American experience here in Idaho is that because the population was always just so much smaller, they didn't experience the same kind of racial prejudices that existed in other parts of the country. And so because that was just lessened, they had more opportunity to, pursue that quote unquote American dream of land ownership and home ownership. But again, it was just such a smaller scale. And I know that the folks at the Black History Museum do a really good job kind of characterizing that Black experience. So again, I would check their resources out as well.
Great information, thank you. One other comment regarding Margaret Stevenson Roberts. Apparently her archives are in the Schlesinger Library of the Harvard Archives, which you may know. So she may be the only woman in Idaho with archives in that national location, according to our Columbian Club leaders.
Yeah, and I've been in touch with them. I've received research copies, so I'm fortunate that I've been able to at least look at those materials. Interestingly, she passed away just a couple of months before Merle Wells became the state historian here at the agency. And I am 99% sure that had her death not, had Merle joined just 6 months before her death, we would have been the recipients of those materials and not Harvard.
Oh.
But that's okay, because we can
so
still
no
tell
turf
her.
war going to happen there. You're going to let them just keep it. Okay. I'm looking at the chat and the Q&A. I don't see any new questions, but a whole bunch of thanks and appreciation for your time, Anna Lori.
Of course. I was so happy to do this.
Thank you. So we will be posting this on the IWCF website for those that want to go back and review the information.
Perfect.
Before I let you go, however, and do that, I want everyone to know of a couple upcoming things. Education has great things going, but grants also is happening right now. So hope you can join if you are able, the grant Q&A session Wednesday, this March 10th, this Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. till 1. That will be recorded too. If you're not able to jump on Wednesday morning, do check the website for that, the Q&A for the grants. We've got a lot of great finalists. I got to be on grants this year, one of the reviewers, and it's going to be a really tough year, just so you know. Secondly, grants ballot to be mailed out March 15th. Please vote by April 1st. And those are all the announcements that I have. So thanks again, everybody. I really appreciate your time. Hannah Laura, you're amazing. Thank you very much. She did also offer, Hannah Laura offered, if anyone has any questions that come up after we're finished, email them to me. Email them to blackaby1@yahoo.com, and I'll get them to Hannah Laura. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Perfect.
Happy International Women's Day. Have a great one. Bye.